This podcast was developed by the Maryland Restorative Approaches Collaborative, a partnership between the Maryland State Department of Education and the Center for Dispute Resolution at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law to support restorative approaches across Maryland. This episode is the first in the podcast series Restorative Approaches: Our Stories, Our Voices. All of the podcasts are available on CDRUM's Restorative Approaches Resources website.
In this episode, my restorative journey to becoming the restorative educator, Robin McNair defines restorative approaches in schools and discusses how they have guided her work and her family life.
Hello, and welcome to the CDRUM mini podcast series, Restorative Approaches, Our Stories, Our Voices. I am Robin McNair, and I have the pleasure of being your host. In these podcasts, we will be hearing stories of our journeys, our lessons, and our hope for restorative approaches in Maryland and beyond. In this premiere episode, I will define what restorative approaches is in Maryland and share about my personal journey in restorative approaches and how living restoratively has impacted my life, both professionally and personally. But before we get into it, I'd like to thank MSDE for partnering with CDRUM of the University of Maryland Carey Law School to bring these powerful mini podcasts to you. So where do I start? So let's talk about what restorative approaches is. So in Maryland, we define restorative approaches as a relationship-focused mindset that uses distinct processes and ways of being to build relationships, to create a positive school climate, create school cultures that's inherently just, racially equitable, and conducive to learning for all students in the school community. It emphasizes building relationships, and once those relationships have been established, if conflict or harm happens, we're able to use a restorative approach to help address the harm and to repair any harm that has happened as a result of the conflict that took place. And this allows for the people impacted by that particular incident that took place to come together and to resolve and come to an agreement of how we can move forward and strengthen those relationships that were broken as a result of that particular incident. So when we think about restorative approaches, we think about relationships first. We think about building those relationships, building community, where if something takes place, people feel safe enough and brave enough to address it, to talk about what their needs are, to talk about their feelings, and to work to resolve whatever issue has come up to cause this particular conflict or harm. And it just works to create a safe school environment for everyone. So let's think about relationships first when we think about restorative approaches. All right, so on to my personal journey and how I became involved in restorative approaches. So I started teaching in the 1990s. And of course, during that time, restorative approaches was not too big nationally. And we relied a lot on zero tolerance policies. And these zero tolerance policies basically just did not give young people an opportunity to have a voice in incidents that took place in the school. And they allow for the increase of suspensions and expulsions in our schools. Now, don't get me wrong, zero tolerance policies were created in response to a horrific incident that took place in our schools. And the response was if a young person brings a weapon to school, they are to be suspended, they are to be expelled, no questions asked. So the intention was to, quote unquote, keep our schools safe. Unfortunately, the impact of that is what has harmed many of our young people during that time. So, of course, I became a teacher during that time, and most of my tenure has been during that zero tolerance period, where we relied on punitive measures to address any type of violation of rules or any type of behaviors that we considered to be inappropriate. Well, moving forward, we know that research has been done to say that excessive suspensions and expulsions harm young people. We know it leads to the school to prison pipeline, which are policies and procedures that help to push our young people out of the classroom, out of the school, and on a path to the juvenile justice system and later in the criminal justice system. So the federal government started to create new guidelines around how we respond to certain types of behavior violations, specifically disrespect, insubordination, class disruption. And the guideline says that schools must shift how they respond to these subjective behaviors. So schools stopped suspending for minor incidents such as, um, disrespect, talking back to a teacher. So with this being said, the shift came in the policies, but nobody told the teachers about the shift. So here we are, educators, me specifically, an educator who was used to putting young people out of my classroom, who was used to sending young people to the office because their behaviors was not what I wanted it to be. And all of a sudden, I send them out and they're coming right back. So I started questioning, why is this happening? So what do? I speak up at a meeting and I say, we send our young people out of the classroom and they come right back. What's going on? And the response to my complaining was, okay, Robin, well, we'll let you be in charge of the discipline committee to try to come to a middle point. What can we do? So as I met with the committee and we started looking at some of the interventions, we noticed that restorative practices was one of those interventions. And I asked the committee, has anybody heard of restorative practices? And none of the people on the committee, knew what it was. Somebody had heard about it, but really didn't know what it was about. So I started to investigate. I started to research what this was. I went to different conferences, and I found out that restorative practices was a way to allow young people to have a voice in the incident that they were involved in and have a voice into how they were going to be held accountable for making this incident right. So I said, this is something we need in Prince George's County. So I came back, I started advocating, started pushing. I had the Teachers Association advocating and pushing for restorative practices, and specifically to allow for educators to be trained in it, because it was already in our policy, in our student code of conduct, but teachers really hadn't been trained in it. So we worked together to get training for these educators. And long story short, the district adopted restorative practices, as it was called at that time in Prince George's County. And we started getting teachers trained in it. Teachers started seeing a transformation in their classrooms. And then the school system decided we're going to go full force with this as a result of the law, House Bill 725. And they created a position where they had one person in the county to help support the schools, to help schools get the training they needed to implement restorative practices in their schools. So I, of course, now serve as that district coordinator. But on a personal level, restorative approaches for me was a transformation of how I was in relationship with my students in the classroom and how I was in relationship with my son. In the classroom, I worked to build community with my young people. Instead of me telling them what the expectations were or telling them what the rules were, I worked with them so we could create classroom agreements that we all needed in order to be in good relationship in our classroom. I worked with my young people to kind of address incidents that came up so they had an opportunity to share what they were thinking or feeling when they decided to show this particular type of behavior. And it was so amazing that my students stopped skipping class. My students wouldn't even skip class when a substitute was there because they wanted to remain with their classmates. And it changed how I left the school at the end of the day. I was no longer frustrated. I was no longer tired. I left school in a very good space because I had let a lot of that high expectation, punitive mindset go. And moving away from the classroom, when I think about restorative approaches, I always say that if you are a restorative practitioner, it doesn't end when you walk out of the schoolhouse. And for me, that's exactly what happened. When I came home, I started I started being restorative and practicing restorative ways of being with my son. And that changed the dynamics of my household. I started talking to my son instead of talking at my son, I started listening to my son instead of talking over him or telling him what he should have done or what he could have done, but really being in good relationship with him where I listened, where I had empathy, and it taught him to listen and to also see my side and maybe understand how some of his actions were impacting me. So for me, restorative practices and restorative approaches has become a way of life. That is who I am. I am restorative. So that is my journey. And if I had to leave something with you to talk about, if I had to leave something with you for you to remember about restorative approaches, it would be when we work to build relationships and be in good relationships with one another, we can work to transform our communities and our world. So that's my story. And that's basically our time. I want to thank you so much for spending your precious time with me and with CDRUM Restorative Approaches, our stories, our voices. Until the next time, where we will have some other Maryland restorative practitioners to share their stories, I would love for you to be well. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. This podcast, copyright 2023, by the Center for Dispute Resolution at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, is licensed for sharing under the Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. For more information about the Creative Commons license, please visit creativecommons.org. All of the podcasts in this series are available on our Restorative Approaches Resources website, cdrum.org.